Oh, it's very nice of the audience to realize that these first three rows are filled with ghosts. So they would have been very upset if you start sitting on them. As Bela Lugosi said in the original Dracula movie, I bid you welcome. And I do bid you welcome to our event today. Chris Nofziger in the flesh, in person. He's going to have a wonderful program today on cemeteries in St. Louis. You will be amazed at how many things is he so-called uncovered in this. I see the Dr. John, Patty, and BH are way up there in the peanut gallery. And gosh, this is just, last night I did a program related to this subject at the St. Louis Women's Club, a beautiful place at 4600 Lindell. And one person afterwards came up and told me a long story and wanted my advice. She has an apartment, or maybe it's a condo, a rental in, I've forgotten where, in Colorado, that she goes every year, and she thinks it's haunted, or thought it was. A matter of fact, when she first got there, things like the vacuum cleaner would turn on, or the vacuum cleaner was always a vacuum cleaner for a while, would fall. And then a fluorescent light fixture cover fell one night for no apparent reason. She actually called the police, and a policeman stayed outside thinking there could be vandals or something. But she realized it's something different. And she decided on her own that it was a ghost or a spirit. She also talked to somebody who lived there once before, and they said the place was haunted. And she did some of the things that I'll talk about today. Advice, if you have a ghost, how do you get rid of a ghost? Well, she followed this advice. A ghost was actually a poltergeist. Doing a lot of silly things, and she got rid of the ghost, as far as I know, as far as she knows. Well, a lot of ghosts, there's no shortage of them here in St. Louis. Actually, our city is considered to be the most haunted city in the USA. And we'll talk about some of the dearly departed of our town who often stick around as representatives of the spirit world. Now, I couldn't find any quotes from ghosts, but this one, in a way, is close. It's by a person who may be in the audience today, even though he's passed away. It's a St. Louis native, the poet T.S. Eliot. He said it very near the time of his death in 1965, when he was 76 years old. Eliot wrote, "The years between 70 and 80 are the hardest, as you are always being asked to do things, and yet you are not decrepit enough to turn them down." Well, with this in mind, I thank the Missouri Historical Society for asking me to talk a bit about ghosts. And since I've got a birthday coming up, 85 this Thursday, I'm not, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'm not planning on more in-person presentations after the ones that I've already booked to do. Or a few, but at some point, like T.S. Eliot did, he had to stop or do other things. I'll continue to do a feature on KMOX each Sunday morning from 8:50 to 9, as well as occasional at-your-service programs. And I'm working on a series of St. Louis history video programs called the Johnny Rabbit Project with Oasis and other organizations like the History Museum and Channel 9. That is probably several months off for sure. Our ghostly visit is going to take us into the mystic. As we seem to know about Halloween in St. Louis, all the decorations, it's incredible. The supernatural and strange celebration. My intrigue of this eerie period started with listening to radio shows on KMOX, such as Inner Sanctum Mystery, Suspense, The Shadow, Lights Out, X-1, a great sci-fi show. There was even the annual Ozzie and Harriet Halloween special. And I recall tuning into them. They were just great broadcasts for listening, or in a way watching, and that's what we did in the days of radio. You kind of saw what was on the radio, even though you didn't see them. You had everybody in mind, what they looked like. And a lot of this I did on my great-uncle Benno Giebert's beautiful, all wood, very big, 1942 Philco 380X radio console. It was in the massive and dark living room of his home at 70 Vandeventer Place. Now, there's nothing left of that place, that whole street. The house that he believed was haunted by a previous owner of the mansion, whose name was Eman Ravold. And next door at 72 Vandeventer Place, everyone in the street, which was just 2 blocks long, but 2 long blocks ran from Grand to Vandeventer, believed that house was haunted by the son of the owner, a noted artist at the time, J. Scott McNutt. His son was killed, and as a memorial and connection to his son, McNutt had painted a huge, full-body, life-size oil painting in this huge frame of the young man, which was one of the first things you'd see when you entered the foyer. Well, McNutt and Guibert McNutt was really a very famous artist at the time, and he was with the Washington U Art Department. They're gone as if they'd never been. Nothing remains there of Vandeventer Place, once the city's finest street, in its original location, but the stone entrance of the private place was saved and removed very close to where we are today. Here in Forest Park, a real St. Louis oddity, because it's just sort of sitting in a field all by itself at the Jewel Box, just a little bit northeast of the Jewel Box. It's like a half a block walk, kind of a windy walk today and kind of cool. There are those who study the occult who say there are ghostly impressions that resonate at that gate. Possible. Could be worth a trip to find out tonight on Halloween. Now, my first hands-on psychic experience happened in 1949 when my grossmother, or grandmother, introduced me to the mysterious, otherworldly Ouija board. She had purchased it at a long ago and faraway kids store, which is a really nice store, I recall, Edith Stix Friedman's Playroom at 7630 Forsyth. I didn't have any luck conjuring spirits with the game's mysterious planchette, this little triangular device. Through a medium in St. Louis that somebody real had success, Pearl Curran made a career of conversing with the long-dead Patience Worth through a Ouija board. And you can see how such a device was used in the movie What Lies Beneath, another scary, eerie movie. Well, we'll talk more about that board in a little while. But as I said, I didn't have any occult occurrences with the game, so I stuffed it in the basement rafters, and everybody knows the Ouija, of course, is a silly board game. It's not haunted or anything. But after a while, I kept thinking about it, didn't like having it around, so I threw it in the furnace and never got a replacement. Too scary for me. I was thinking back as things that I did that related to the occult. When I was a kid, I worked on occasion for 50 cents an hour in the pharmacy of Art Montgomery and Eddie Hill's Arts Cut-Rate Drugstore. It was what then was 3136 Easton Avenue. My jobs were making so-called spirit candles and packaging voodoo products that came from New Orleans. A parade of psychic purchasers treated these products with august seriousness. In those times, the spook business, as it was called, was quite big. You've traveled in the right circles there, you could easily find palmists, fortune tellers, tarot card readers, mediums, spiritualists, ghost chasers, and clairvoyants, as well, maybe locating a couple of good seances. The Central West End, there's a place that has no shortage of the supernatural occurrences. I guess some consider the most would be at the Chase Park Plaza Hotel. Now, this is the beginning of the hotel. It's being built. This is the Chase Hotel under construction. The best known of the hotel ghosts there is actually a red-haired ghost in a white dress who initially appeared in the mid-1930s in room 302 of the Park Plaza. A few years ago, probably in the 80s, I'd imagine, there was a representative of Walt Disney Studios was in that room, and he, according to Jeannie Venn, the chief concierge, he came to the front desk. He said, I got to have a different room. Somebody keeps going in and out of this room. He described a red-headed lady with a white dress. So who knows? From 1929, of course, things changed here. The Park Plaza would be built. There's the Chase. Off in the background on the right, that was the Kingsway or Ambassador Kingsway Hotel. And they're getting ready for the construction of the Park Plaza. It's a hotel that was designed after the Savoy Plaza in New York City, which Sam Coppler and others saw. That hotel no longer exists, but we have the beautiful Park Plaza here. Well, the red-headed ghost, the reason she's a ghost, she died there at the hotel. Either fell or jumped to her death, And the ghost story was readily accepted by the owners of the hotel, the Park Plaza, the Koppler family, Sam Koppler, later Harold Koppler, and it became kind of an urban legend that they, in a way, promoted. That is, promoted until they sold the hotel, their family, to the General Electric Credit Corporation, and they come up with a story that wasn't about ghosts. They didn't want to talk about death in any way at the hotel. Well, we'll come back to the Park Plaza, but a spooky old 19th century red brick mansion that you might like to look at, and you can see it. It's in the Grand Center area, just a few blocks away on the northwest corner of Washington and Compton. Now, for a very long time, it housed the medical offices of one of my great uncles, Dr. Fred W. Tiber. He actually lived at 24 Fair Oaks, but he kept his office there. It was also home to another great uncle, Heinz Preidecker. Tiber, who studied occult sciences and the philosophy of magic, maintained an extensive Japanese spirit garden behind the house so he could commune with spirits. And I haven't been in that area for a couple of years, but there may still be some vestiges of that spirit rock garden in the back. The doctor, of course, is no longer there except in spirits. But now we go back to the Park Plaza when it opened. This was their first picture that they used for promotion and advertising. Pretty kind of an ethereal picture. This is before the hotel was built, and it came out to look almost exactly like this. The late Jim Smith and Bill Stallings bought the hotel and the Chase many years later, and they were okay with the ghosts, and they kept a few other ghosts around too. The other ghost that had been found in the hotel, Sam Koppler, he created the Park Plaza and still said he walks the halls as he did when it was being built, as well as Bob Koppler, the son of Harold Koppler and hotel heir apparent to Harold. His other son, Ted, was in the TV business, not the hotel business, KPLR TV. But Bob died of a heart attack at the age of 34, and he has been occasionally observed in the Chase Hotel. In a conversation I had last week with Jeannie Venn, the many-year chief concierge there, some of the other ghosts that guests say that they have seen, Dr. Jacob Probstein, who was the hotel doctor. He was also the first doctor for the St. Louis Blues, and he lived in the Park Plaza. Alberto Villalobos, he was a longtime employee, a fixture at the place, worked there for 50 years, as did Hack Ulrich, who was the maitre d' of the Chase Club and then later the Tenderloin Room. And one not from the family or didn't work there was Julian Miller of Prom Magazine. He's supposedly still hanging around. Julian Miller was the publisher of Prom from 1947 to 73, and early on in his years, his offices were there, and he also lived there. And he had a deal. In Prom Magazine, the only hotel he'd ever talk about or write about was the Chase Park Plaza. And they had prom press parties that were almost without exception. One was Eddie Fisher was at the Empress Theater. Everybody else, Frank Sinatra, you name it, they were in prom, and it was promoted as being a prom party at the Chase Hotel, usually in the Starlight Roof. But he did other things there, and he did a lot of promotional work for Koppler. So they decided he didn't have a lot of money, and his father, a rabbi, asked Harold Koppler if they'd help him out financially, and they said, well, here's what we'll do. We'll give him free room and board for as long as he lives here. So he got free food, never had to pay for food, never had to pay for his office, never had to pay for his apartment. After he passed away, I was doing some jobs for the hotel. I saw his bill. It was over $600,000 that they had given him over the years. So no wonder his ghost wants to stick around at the place. Why not? What the heck? And I think that's pretty much it for, other than one other person that people say they see on the 9th floor of the Chase, which was his office was located there, was the person for whom the Chase was named. His name was Chase Ullman. Chase Ullman was an attorney, real estate and developer, and 101 years ago built the hotel that bears his name. He lived and died in the Chester Apartments, which is now connected to the hotel next to the Chase Park Plaza cinema entry. And when I was creating the hotel's memorabilia room called the Legacy Room, that sadly after 12 years, has been turned into a storage room, unfortunately, with a lot of great artifacts of the past in there. And we moved, one of the things was the Chester Apartments' original pristine condition elevator to the legacy room. Well, at the time we were decorating, and a scenic artist was helping us. He worked full-time at the Muni. He was painting some murals, and he said one day he saw a man open the gate of the elevator and get out of the elevator and just disappeared, just simply vanished. And we had him look at some photos, and he identified Chase Ullman as the person he saw. Well, he sent another Muni artist to finish the job. I can't imagine why. He never came back. As I was reading portions of a strange little book I have, a very small book, it came to mind that likely the greatest collection of books about the occult, the paranormal, is locked away. But you can see it on request. It's in the book vault of the St. Louis Mercantile Library, that for 25 years now has been in the Thomas Jefferson Library building at the University of Missouri, St. Louis. And as a Mercantile Life member and board member, I know that head librarian John Hoover would be pleased to let you examine his unique collection. You would need to make an appointment. The rare book I have was printed in 1847. It's called The Occult Sciences, Philosophy of Magic, Prodigies, and Apparent Miracles. It has articles related to such fun things as torture by stupefying drugs. Everybody loves that. The predisposition to credulity converted to realities, whatever that means. And there are literally hundreds of other just really weird items. The book came from the library of the late Dr. Fred W. Grundman, who also studied the occult. His house was considered to be haunted by his three Spencer daughters. That was at 3737 Washington in Grand Center. Now it's gone. Nothing is there anymore. Kind of joining the growing list of lost St. Louis buildings that have been torn down. To me, what we have here next is what I consider probably the most haunted or paranormal infested building of all St. Louis buildings. It's the former 11th District Police Station. Looks just like this today. You can see it. It's at 14 North Newstead, a few blocks from here. It's in the center of the block on the east side of Newstead between West Pine and Laclede. But the current owners of the property have no interest in talking about the odd and supernatural things that have happened there. And that's true with a lot of people who have haunted buildings. Some want to tell you all about it, some just don't want to mention it to anyone. But they're a matter of record at this place. The building dates to 1905. It remained a St. Louis police station until 1960. The first ghost was from 1944. A young Mexican immigrant was being held in a holdover cell, and he suddenly died of a heart attack, and no reason was ever given as to why it happened. And he would be seen by different police officers still in the building for many years. Next, this is a very large police building. It's not some little place like they have today. On the evening of October 5th, now this is not a ghost story, but it's an eccentric story nonetheless, internationally known. October 5th, 1953, Lieutenant Louis Shoulders and Officer Elmer Dolan arrested Carl Austin Hall and Bonnie Emily Brown Hetty for the kidnapping and murder of 6-year-old Bobby Greenlease, who was the son of a wealthy Kansas City Cadillac dealer. The officers brought Hall and Hetty along with 2 very large metal suitcases that contained $600,000 in ransom money to the station, to their offices. The largest amount of money as ransom to ever have been paid in the United States. But when the cash was counted the next day, half the money was missing. And to this date, people are still searching for it. They've looked through a place where one of them stayed, the Lorelei Hotel at Euclid and McPherson. It's no longer there. They even dug up most of the yard of mafia boss Tony Giordano, Tony G, in St. Louis Hills. And they did searching with Joe Costello. They think he's a guy that that laundered the money, so to speak. He was the owner of Ace Cab Company. Other things happened in this building. A couple to me. Ted Martin, who had a real estate company here, knew that I was interested in getting a new location for a business I had. The National Broadcasting Institute was a radio school in the Continental Building. But Charles Guggenheim, he's the guy who did the movie that plays at the Arch. And he had a studio, just finished it there, but he decided to move to Washington, D.C. So I looked at the building. It was really a beautiful setup, and I remember being all the way in the back. It was wide open, no furniture or anything in there. You could see that front door that you could see there in the picture. And I was at the end of the building, and I very clearly heard the door open and footsteps coming my way. And I knew nobody else was in the building. I had checked that out. And so I called out that I was there, who I was, and the steps kept coming. And when I just looked out, gone. Nobody there, nothing. And nobody was upstairs. So I left and I didn't come back. I did not rent the space. I couldn't think about being there very much. Another mysterious thing were electronic sounds. They came out, Howard Jones was an artist who lived there and had a studio there. He worked a lot with electronics as far as artwork. And some of his works were at the Art Museum and other museums. They may still be around the country. And he had a big bank of equipment, audio-type equipment, and for his work recording things. And he said he would get mysterious electronic sounds, stuff like that, coming out of these speakers for no apparent reason. So he thought we were the perpetrators, accidentally, of it. When I was manager of KADI radio at the time, and we had our tower antenna on top of the Continental Building, and the transmitter was there, and that was pretty close to him. And he thought maybe our equipment was playing around with his. So I went there with our engineer, Mike Rice, and we did everything to the equipment, turned everything off. Still the sounds would come. They wouldn't be constant, but like every 3 or 4 minutes it would start. Unplugged everything, didn't stop it. Went to the basement and turned off the power to the entire building. And the sound still came out of the speakers. Never been able to figure out why or how it was done. There were also, he left, a couple of food photographers, lived there for a while. And the first thing that happened to them, there was this big, it had been used like a room to get all of the policemen together in uniform and so on. It was almost like a gymnasium type room. And 2 big windows in front. I think you can see one of those have been boarded up now for this picture. And incidentally, in that picture, they're removing a cell door as they're ready to remodel the building. And they had varnished the floor with sticky varnish, and there were a whole bunch of stuff they had put in a windowsill of one of the windows. Next morning, they looked in, and all the stuff from the windowsill was in another window, a pretty good distance, and no trace of anything. Not even the varnish was still sticky, no trace of footsteps or anything. But the big story, and Jack Rice, who was a writer for the Post-Dispatch, wrote about this. He went there to experience it himself. They would hear somebody crossing the floor, going to the door that led to this big room into their apartment, and turn the doorknob, and nothing would happen. So he actually did it. Jack was there. And the sound came, he had his hand on the doorknob turned, he opened the door, and there was nobody there. So those are just some of the things that happened at that place. And if you go to look at it on Newstead between West Pine and Laclede, it's really a very spooky-looking building. I think spooky buildings seem to attract spooky characters. Now, decades ago, I worked on some serious spirit searches with the local but nationally known parapsychological investigators, the late Phil Goodwilling and Gordon Hayner. They really had a penchant for tracking down ghosts, and they were very sincere about it, an eccentric enterprise, but nonetheless, they seemed to do a good job. The company was founded in 1965, and it was called the Haunt Hunters. Phil was a Teamsters Union executive. Gordon was a banker. And finding ghosts is what they really loved to do and excelled at it. They actually wrote a do-it-yourself book on the subject. It's a ghost guide called The Haunt Hunters, a handbook for the psychic investigator. And that book was used in the writing of the 1984 movie Ghostbusters. And there were just 500 copies of the Haunt Hunters book printed, so it's quite a challenge to find one. I've never found one, but I guess somebody's got them around. The late Harold Ramis, he was a co-writer of the movie along with Dan Aykroyd, found out about it, got interested in the Ghost Chaser plot when he was a student at Washington University and came across the book in the school's Olin Library. Some of the book tells of the ghost, too, of Henry Whittemore. Henry Whittemore is the ghost host and the residence at Whittemore House, the WashU Faculty Club, 6440 Forsyth. Henry is still there, quite often seen in ghostly form, usually wearing a red and black flannel shirt as he glides along the railing of the mezzanine of the house's entry foyer. And I say glides because his apparition, which can only be seen for a few seconds, has no legs. It's nothing from the waist down. But many people have seen Henry over the years. Washington U, too, was once a very active paranormal studies program that was underwritten by James McDonald and McDonnell Douglas, but that program ceased to exist following his death in 1980. Curious clients of the Haunt Hunters often sought answers to questions such as, how can I get rid of ghosts? Should I be afraid of a ghost or a spirit? What's the difference between a ghost and a spirit? And if a haunted place ceases to exist, where does a ghost go? For some of those troubled by ghosts, they often think they're as hard to get rid of as roaches, but that's not true. Not always the case. One haunt hunter tip is to keep ghosts from entering your premises in the first place. And this could be as simple as painting your door red. Any shade of red will do. But if a ghost is already inside, well, getting rid of them might be problematic, not as easy to do. But you start by telling them emphatically and forcefully to get out and stay out. They're not wanted there. But since they've chosen your home to be their home, and just maybe they were there first, they generally take a little time. It could be days to months for them to finally leave, to take the hint and skedaddle. Unfortunately, Rottler Pest Control is not in the ghost eradicating business, or they'd make it simple. Another tried and true ghost removal method is to burn such things as white sage and cedar in an incense burner and then move from room to room while strongly, every step of the way, telling the ghost they are not wanted to get out. Another haunt hunter's question, should you be afraid of a ghost or spirit? The answer is a simple one, it's no. And that any fear you might have is all in your mind, and you should subconsciously think better thoughts about them and talk to them if you want. Verbally, tell the ghost it needs to move on. The ghost, I don't know of any case of ghosts hurting anyone in St. Louis, and there are many cases of ghosts. Another question is, are ghosts and spirits one and the same? They are not. For a variety of reasons, a ghost is usually tied to a specific earthly location, but can be urged to move. But a spirit can travel anywhere in space and time. This is explained by the teaching of the Spiritualist Church at their St. Louis location, 6026 South Kings Highway, where in part they study calmness in a world of anxiety and fear, as well as life after death. And they really believe in that. And I've had a couple of experiences there. That church is where, when I was hosting a ghost tour for the Missouri Historical Society a few years back, we stopped to hear about their studies. As I was sitting in a back pew, a woman from the congregation sat right next to me and whispered very softly that just the night before she had spoken with an old friend of mine who asked her to let me know that he was very proud that I was still on the radio. And I was quite surprised when she, in all sincerity, said the friend was Walter Nothice, better known as Walter Scott, who was the lead singer of Bob Cuban's 1966 hit The Cheater. The surprise was that Walter had been dead for 25 years. She swore it was true, though. Another gruesome murder story, you can read about it in Bob Cuban's book, The Cheater. The other big question, if a haunted place is torn down, burned down, or whatever is gone, what becomes of the haunting entity? If a ghost is haunting a specific place, now not a spirit, but a ghost, it would likely remain in the physical space, even if there was nothing there, possibly, though, in a new structure, or maybe just as a psychic impression. Now, here's another building not too far from us, down just off of Lendell and West Pine. It's a lady-in-waiting there at the Ellsworth apartment building at 4405 West Pine on the northwest corner of Newstead. And the building looks almost identical today to this photo from the 1920s. The ethereal lady, described as having auburn-colored hair and wearing what seems to be a long white nightgown, has been seen since 1930 inside the glass front door of the lobby entrance, the one on West Pine in the center of the building. But if you look in there and see her, generally she will quickly vanish. It's thought she may be Violet Hilberly, who in 1930 lived in apartment 812 of the Ellsworth. The spirit sighting only happens after dark. Well, I'm out of time right now because we're going to have Chris Knopfsiger. We've got a lot more pictures to show you. Unfortunately, we're going to see his pictures of the dead. Now, he didn't have any ghosts in his pictures, but boy, does he have a lot of stuff about cemeteries in St. Louis and who's buried there, and the treasures that are there, the great statuary and mausoleums and artwork. I will mention one more thing. Maybe I can put one more picture on here. The Lemp Mansion. Yep, there it is. It reminds me of the Ghost and Mr. Chicken, the 1966 Don Knotts movie, because it relates to Dick Pointer Sr. He started the restaurant in the basement of the mansion. As you can see, the basement area there, it was just toward the back. Dining room was one side, and the kitchen was on the other. The rest of the house was in very, very, very bad condition, and his business was terrible. He was an advertiser on KXOK in 75, and he said, I can't continue to advertise, so we're not making any money. The only thing he was making any money on were the family-style chicken dinners on Sunday, which were absolutely great. Maybe they still have them. But I told him, why don't you create a ghost? This is a real spooky building. And he said, oh, no, we don't have enough business now, so they think the place is haunted. Nobody's going to come here. Well, he was wrong about that, but it didn't take him more than a few weeks to decide, well, we'll create a ghost. So, in a sense, I created the ghost at the Lemp Mansion. If you go back before 75, there are no sightings of ghosts, and now it's built from 1 to 2 to 3. I think there are 5 ghosts there now. Even the ghost of a dog is there. Charles Lemp in 1949, I think it was August of 49, committed suicide in his upstairs bedroom, but before he did, he shot his Doberman Pinscher who was in the basement, and it died. It was found crawling up to him on the front stairway. One more. Then I have to stop, Chris. I promise I'll stop. This is the security building at 319 North 4th Street in Locust as it looked when it opened in 1892. And I tell you, it looks much the same as then as it is today. It's the official city landmark number 96. That 11-story structure is on the National Register of Historic Places as well. Plus, it has one ghost. It's the haunted spirit of one-time St. Louis Cardinal baseball manager who was 54 years old when he committed suicide, Oliver Patsy Thibault. Oliver Patsy, most people call him Patsy, used a gun to commit suicide in the office of the saloon he owned in the building called the Court Bar. That was you can't see it, there is a domed lobby in there, very big. It's still there, too. When Patsy's body was found at 6:30 a.m., he had a revolver tied to his wrist with a piece of blue twine. A hand mirror lay on the floor beside the table at which he was sitting. He had been suffering from heart disease and had difficulty walking. He left a sealed suicide note that ended with the message, I have a heavy heart. I am a very unhappy and miserable man. Thibault resigned as the Cards manager and was also first baseman in August 1900 to go into the saloon business. So that's it for here. You try to find some ghosts. That's your assignment today. Go find a ghost. I bet you'll come up with one or two if you really look and really think about it. Maybe where you live. Maybe that strange sound you hear once in a while is more than just a strange sound. And a lot of people do hear sounds. A lot of it has to do with electromagnetic fields. And it is difficult to decide what's real and what isn't real, but it's worth investigating and thinking about. And there's a lot of good books about ghosts, or things like the Exorcist that was done here, the Great Exorcism. That's also worth reading about, because that was all true and it all happened in St. Louis. I've got to stop talking. Chris, you better come up and give me the... Thank you all very much. Thank you.
Well, welcome, everybody. Thank you so much, Mr. Rabbit, Johnny. And we'll go ahead and get started. So I thought it'd be interesting to sort of see some of the interesting cemeteries. I'm sure maybe many of you have seen the movie Poltergeist, right? You know, the famous line, you moved the headstones, but you didn't move the bodies. Well, that's kind of what this presentation's about. There's this really wonderful map in the collection of the Missouri History Museum that shows all the cemeteries that were back in St. Louis before the Civil War. And we're going to be talking about some of the famous cemeteries. Not all of them. There's obviously probably 100 cemeteries around St. Louis. But let's talk about some of the more interesting ones. So the first one is Coldwater Cemetery. This is actually one that you can visit to this day. It's one of the oldest ones, probably that still survive. Way up in North St. Louis County, north of Florissant, around 1830, probably a little bit older than that. It's a really cool cemetery. You go down this road, and it's one lane, and you hope that you don't reach another car isn't coming, because there's no room on either side to get over. When I visited, actually, I met a car about 100 feet down, and luckily I was able to back up 100 feet and let them proceed on their way, and then I drove really fast, so I hopefully didn't meet someone else. But anyway, it's very cool. Some Revolutionary War heroes buried there as well. I encourage you to visit. And then, like I said, this is the Schultze map, as I call it, from 1852, and I found out about a lot of cemeteries I never had heard about, as well as some cemeteries I had known about, but I didn't actually know where they were. So I'm going to show them to you, and I think they're actually really interesting. So I put the little skull on the left to show you where the cemetery is, and then on the right I have a little detail of it. So this first one's fascinating. Turned out that James Bissell, I think it's James, right? Either John, it's really common names back then, John and James. Bissell's cemetery, this one no longer exists. In fact, I couldn't find any information about Bissell's cemetery. So it's actually really fascinating. Up in the town of Bremen, which was once an independent town north of St. Louis, now the neighborhood of Hyde Park. Very interesting. Of course, Bissell's Point is where there's actually still a water treatment plant to the present day, providing award-winning water to the city of St. Louis. Also, the Presbyterian Cemetery. It only existed before 1852 to 1865. After the Civil War, a lot of cemeteries were moved out of the center city because it was growing so fast. So it was located just up north of Washington Avenue on Jefferson Avenue. You can see it right there, Presbyterian Cemetery. It's long gone, but of course, like I said, they probably didn't move all the bodies. Oh, look at that. Back in 1990, what did they discover? One of the tombstones lying down. Generally, they didn't actually move all of the skeletons, to be honest. And also down, this is actually really fascinating. You know Christ Church Cathedral, right? The headquarters of the Episcopal Church here in St. Louis, and also St. Vincent's Cemetery. They both existed long before the Civil War, and after the Civil War, they started moving away. And they were located down off of South Jefferson, just south of Choteau Avenue, excuse me. You can see them right there. St. Vincent's Cemetery was located just south of Lafayette Avenue, and there was the Episcopal Cemetery, which is what they labeled on the map, but that was actually the Christ Church Cemetery. They're long gone, though probably not completely long gone, we might say. And Old Wesleyan Cemetery, 1847 to about 1874, a very fascinating old cemetery. This is actually the original burial place of Dred Scott. It was located up basically around Laclede and Grand Boulevard. I think you understand that right after the Civil War, this was not the best place for a cemetery anymore because, of course, Midtown was growing very rapidly out there. So, and also, you all heard of Lillian Handlin, right? The Lavender Lady, the wife of Billy Lemp Jr. He actually, her father owned a baseball diamond. He was actually owned a professional baseball team, actually right near this location. And even in 1875, you can actually see that sort of forested area right there, and you can see how it's labeled Grand. That is actually where the cemetery was. And Dred Scott and a couple of his family members were buried there, not his wife, Harriet. She lived much longer than he did, but you can see the houses were creeping out there already. So Old Wesleyan Cemetery was moved, so to speak, and then it was moved out to New Wesleyan Cemetery out at Hanley and Olive Boulevard, which in turn, that cemetery was moved, as you can see, with what I would call maybe an old-fashioned bobcat, and it's now a Walgreens. So whether or not they actually moved it very well, there's actually a very large Jewish cemetery right across Hanley right there, North Hanley. You might know it, yeah. And down, speaking of the Lemps, since you brought them up, Johnny, down south at the corner of Cherokee and Lemp were two cemeteries, and someone stole the skull, apparently, and ran off with it, but it was located down right across from the Lemp Brewery. There was the German Evangelical Cemetery and the Baptist Cemetery. And if you know that area, was a school down there, and the playground was on top of the cemetery. I don't know how much people ever actually used these cemeteries before they were moved. But to make a long story short, there are a lot of houses built on that site as well. During the Civil War, that was actually the site of a fort that protected the city of St. Louis. Never saw any battle, but I actually wonder how much that was ever actually used, to be honest. But there's still, to this day, it's completely blacktopped over. It was a playground. And then there's a nice confusing cemetery. You all know Roosevelt High School, right? Down on Gravois and Compton. That was the site of Old Pickers Cemetery, or also we call it Holy Ghost after the church. Remember, the Lutheran churches all had their own cemeteries as opposed to the Catholic Church, which had the archdiocese that ran the cemeteries. So there was Old Pickers Cemetery, which was named after the pastor who founded it. And there it is. Again, the skull got stolen by a grave robber. But anyway, it was right at the corner of Compton and Wyoming and Gravois. Did anyone go to Roosevelt out here? Raise your hand if you went to Roosevelt. Oh, okay. Oh, great. Thank you. I live right by your old school. Anyway, they occasionally, apparently, when they dig around at Roosevelt, they still find some skeletons occasionally. Anyway, there's a beautiful Roosevelt. Designed by, of course, Ittner and Milligan. And then, of course, there's Old New Pickers Cemetery, which is down on Gravois, down sort of in the, near the city boundary with Afton. And do you all remember when it got foreclosed on for back real estate taxes with the city of St. Louis, and then the city now owns it? I one time talked to somebody at the LRA, and let's just put it this way, the city of St. Louis doesn't like the fact that it has to own this cemetery. Let's just put it that way. And then there's New Picker Cemetery, which is when they bought some property on the other side of Gravois, and that's New Picker Cemetery. Does that make sense? Okay. And then it became a private cemetery called Gatewood Gardens. That's when Holy Ghost disinvested themselves of the cemetery and a private owner. Private cemeteries in the St. Louis region have had lots of problems, let's just put it that way. And now the city of St. Louis, they have to honor the contracts to bury people who own plots in the cemetery, but they have no new sales of property in the cemetery. Make sense? Yeah, they don't like it. They got out of the cemetery business when they sold the Potter's Field back in the 50s over by the psychiatric facility. But yeah, guess what? Just when you thought you were out of the cemetery business, you get back into it. And here's some pictures of it. It's nice and confusing because there's also another Catholic cemetery right next to it, and it's sometimes hard to know which side you're on. Just look for the property where the grass is longer. That's how you know you're at the Gatewood Gardens and not the Catholic cemetery. I'm not joking. Anyway, then there's some pretty creepy, yeah. Always make sure to buy granite, not limestone tombstones for your loved ones. And then there's Rock Springs Cemetery. This was a Catholic cemetery, and I want you all to realize, like, if your ancestors have been in St. Louis for a long time, there's a very strong possibility that before Calvary Cemetery was founded, I've looked at the old death records in the city of St. Louis in the Recorder of Deeds office. A lot of people before the Civil War, if you were Catholic, you were buried in Rock Springs Cemetery. It was a huge number of burials, tens of thousands. Okay, good. No one stole this skull yet. This one was out basically where IKEA was, and anonymous sources have told me that they definitely didn't move all the bodies, as IKEA's project manager discovered. Bellefontaine Cemetery, don't call it the Protestant cemetery. It is non-denominational. My friends who work there have always told me. Founded in the aftermath of the cholera epidemic, they erroneously believed that dead bodies transmitted cholera. That is not true. A dead body cannot sustain cholera bacteria. It's dirty water that spreads cholera. But anyway, it gave birth to beautiful cemeteries such as Bellefontaine and eventually Calvary out north in the Walnut Park neighborhood. Up north, you can see there, and you can see some of the original paths through Bellefontaine Cemetery. And a really beautiful map in the collection of the Missouri History Museum actually shows there was a whole, the rural cemetery movement was inspired by Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris, where Jim Morrison is buried. And then there was a very famous, I think it's called Mount Auburn Cemetery in Boston, and all of these cemeteries around America in major cities like Cleveland, Cincinnati, Detroit were all founded in the 1840s and 50s, inspired by those other two older cemeteries. And of course, the Wainwright tomb, I think we should really, toot our own horns about this. One of 3 mausoleums designed by Louis Sullivan is right here in St. Louis. The other 2 are in Chicago. We should be proud of that. The Bush Mausoleum, how could we not enjoy that beautiful monument? And of course, I'll have to admit, I've been to some events at Bellefontaine where it's been dark, and that place scares me after dark, even though I shouldn't be. It's beautiful after dark. And these are some photos I took. We were given permission to photograph after dark. So it's a really beautiful place. Whoa. Calvary Cemetery, founded by Bishop and eventually Archbishop Kenrick. He had actually held 2 different offices in St. Louis. Calvary Cemetery, founded a little bit later, 1857, but still part of that rural cemetery movement. Huge cemetery. I don't know if you all knew that a new monument has been placed there for Dred Scott. After he was moved there, he was moved to Calvary Cemetery. One of my favorite places in the world is the Biddle Monument, where there has been a tree growing up through the oculus of the dome now for over a decade. It's still alive the last time I checked. That's a little supernatural, I think, actually. The Chouteaus are buried there. And, of course, you got to have some Egyptian monuments, right? And one time I managed to get my friend Regina to walk up on these and scare her pretty badly. I was pretty proud of myself. And it's actually still a tradition to this day for people to come and leave toys on the tombstones of these 2 children who sadly died years ago. Whoops. And for your Civil War buffs, William Tecumseh Sherman and his family are buried. Just look for the flagpole, which is there all the time. Old St. Marcus, do you remember that cemetery? Yeah, it was a mess, right? It's actually been turned into a park in 1977, and it was just a disaster. Did they move them all? Probably not. And of course, there's New St. Marcus across the River de Pere with some cool monuments. A famous beer baron. An adopted grandson of Adam Lemp, Otto Lemp, from one of his third wife's earlier marriages, is buried there with his family, not in Bellefontaine Cemetery like the rest of his family. And then, of course, there's St. Peter and Paul. That's the one that's right next door to Gatewood Gardens, the one that's maintained well. Huge cemetery. Not to forget, Calvary is huge, but St. Peter and Paul is also a very large cemetery as well. And then I think what is actually an incredibly beautiful cemetery, New Mount Sinai Cemetery, which is obviously a Jewish burial ground, which was really, when I finally went in there, I was just really impressed. It's a beautiful cemetery and has one of the few double mausoleums in St. Louis, if not the only one. Then this is perhaps, I think, one of the least well-known cemeteries in St. Louis. It's up in the Greater Ville neighborhood, the Western Lutheran Cemetery. And it is spooky. There's actually a very nice Lutheran congregation that comes and does volunteer work and cleans it up. This photograph was actually taken before they started doing that volunteer work. I'm actually really proud that they're doing this, basically for free. But it's basically pretty much abandoned in many ways, and only because of this volunteer work has it's been fixed up at all. It's a great example of a cemetery that was owned by a congregation that went defunct. This tree is just out of this world. But it's also, the burial place of actually a very famous Lutheran minister. St. Peter's Cemetery, where the very famous Homer G. Phillips of the hospital fame is buried. Also, remember the airport and Washington Park Cemetery. This is where many of the burials is actually in Washington, or is in St. Peter and Paul. St. Matthew's, where the very famous lieutenant of the Lemp family is buried. Henry Volkamp. You can see the hops up, or I should say the wheat and hops up on top of his tombstone. Concordia Cemetery, down south, with that very creepy mausoleum that's kind of all clouded up. And of course, Sunset Burial Park, which is where the Bush family is buried for the most part, just in sight of Grant's Farm. Conway Cemetery, out in West County, there's all sorts of cemeteries where early pioneers are buried. Joseph Conway, if I remember correctly, he was actually scalped by some Native Americans, but survived. So his grandchildren used to ask him if they could feel his skull and feel how, there was missing flesh, apparently. That's the story goes. Kind of a weird story, I know. Also, there were slaves that the family owned are actually buried in the cemetery as well. We shouldn't forget them. As well as Greenwood Cemetery, which is where Harriet Scott is buried. There's been a massive volunteer effort to clear this cemetery after it went out of business. And you can see when I first saw this cemetery, this was all covered in giant, 4 or 5 foot weeds, and it's all been cleared by volunteer work. Here's Harriet's grave. Quinette Cemetery, another African American cemetery as well, which has been restored by the city of Kirkwood. Washington Park, still struggling. I think I want people to still keep this in their minds. It's been cleared up by a lot of volunteer work as well. But much of the cemetery along the interstate is still in very rough shape. We still need to work on getting the cemetery back up to a dignified state. First Baptist Cemetery out in Chesterfield by Chesterfield Mall, another African American cemetery as well. Westland Acres. This was actually owned by the former slaves of the Coleman and Long families. It's still there after all these, over a century. And also, this one is a very rarely visited one, way out in Wildwood. See those little pink flags? That's where the gravestones are. So we can't forget them either. And then out in Wentzville, even out in St. Charles County, there's another cemetery that dates all the way back to before the Civil War. And let's jump over to Alton just really quickly. an amazing cemetery where they still allow fences, by the way. Most of them are banned in cemeteries. Eliza P. Lovejoy, the abolitionist, is buried there as well. And who could forget Monteagle Cemetery, where the very famous mausoleum overlooking the Mississippi River Valley is located. Anyway, that's my presentation. We got 4 minutes to spare. Do I have any ghost stories? I don't know. I was able to explore the Lemp Brewery all over the place, down into the cellars and the caves, and no ghost jumped out at me. My friend Jason and I, who were there, we were kind of disappointed. We were like, well, hey guys, aren't you guys going to kind of jump out at us? I do have a story though. My bed set, I have 2 pieces of furniture and a bed are from my great-great-grandparents. And it used to be in my grandparents' house. And my brother used to sleep on them when we were younger and we'd visit my grandparents. And my brother swore that they used to shake in the middle of the night. The bed used to shake. And we were like, it's not, we didn't believe my brother Jeff. But anyway, I inherited them, and they're now, this is the bed that I sleep in. And maybe about 10 years ago, the bed started shaking in the middle of the night. And I remember thinking, I wasn't afraid. I was like, oh yeah, it's just a haunted bed set. And I just fell right back to sleep. So maybe that's a little bit. And a cousin who moved into the farmhouse said that one night they saw some shadows on the wall, like walking by. So I don't know if that's my grandparents still haunting the house. We don't know. But yeah, I always love the story you tell me about the Lemp Mansion and its ghosts. How ghosts can kind of appear out of nothing, right? Anyway, thanks so much. It's always a pleasure to be here. You always are such a great audience, and you're always such a great host as well.
Well, that's it for today. We will be back with another program in December, and I've forgotten the date. I think it's the first Tuesday in December. It's a history of St. Louis radio and television. So a lot of stuff to cover, a lot of stuff to listen to and to look at, and I hope you can come back for it. Have a great day and enjoy your happy Halloween. Thank you.